Okay, so Will has now shown you how to keep the wheels nice and clean, which will help improve electrical conductivity between the track and the locomotive. But I'm just going to talk to you about the other area where electricity can cause problems, and that's with the pickups between the wheels and the motor. Now, almost all locomotives that we've encountered actually use a little system of copper plates. So in this example here, the electricity flows through the metal of the wheel and then actually passes to this small copper plate here, which makes contact with the back of the wheel to complete the electric circuit. That copper plate just runs along the length of the chassis and bends slightly towards the end so that it pushes against the rear of the wheel. Now there are two areas to look at when cleaning and servicing your loco with regard to these pickups. The first is obviously in the same way that your wheels can get tarnished and dirty, then there's also the chance that there can be some dirt and tarnish that builds up on the plate of the contact. So what you can do is use something nice and thin, so maybe like a craft knife, to be able to just run in between the copper plate and the wheel and very gently just scrape off any tarnish that may have built up. What you can also use is a little of the Dapol track cleaner, but obviously the gap is a little small for getting something like a cotton bud in, so what I normally do is just drip a few drops onto either side of the blade and then very quickly before it's evaporated just run it in between so that it can stay there and evaporate away and clean up any last deposits. The other thing to look for with the contacts is that they're actually making good contact with the wheel. The slight bend in the copper gives it some flexibility so that when these wheels move backwards and forwards like that the contact will follow them and still stay in touch with the back of the wheel. However, we found sometimes, depending on the way it's been constructed or the way it's been run, when it goes round certain corners and pushes to extremes, those metal plates don't quite make contact and you suddenly lose the electrical conductivity through that particular wheel. Now, in a locomotive like this with 4 axles or 8 wheels and all of them actually having contact to conduct electricity, it's not too much of an issue because that one losing contact won't disrupt the electrical flow through all the rest. However, with smaller locomotives where the contacts perhaps only work on 1 or 2 of the axles, you can find that slight motion and that disconnection between the copper plate and the wheel is enough to cut out the whole locomotive on things like points. So if when you move those wheels you notice that there actually is a slight gap between the copper contact and the wheel, you need to bend it a little bit more to be able to make sure it's still making contact. Now, my first initial reaction was to actually use a pair of tweezers, and if I use that pair of tweezers, stick them in and then grab the plate and give it a bend, I thought that might do it. However, as you can perhaps see, the action of doing that pulls it so far away from the wheel that you actually create a bend in the opposite direction that you don't want. So they're not good enough. So the best solution I found is to actually use something much thinner, like a needle or a pin. So this is like a medium-sized needle, and you can slip that just in between the wheel and the copper plate, and then use something else nice and thin, so again like our little craft knife, to push from behind the copper plate, so you can use the two to lever the copper plate slightly and increase the degree of bend. It takes a little bit of practice and works easier with some locomotives than others depending on how much space there is, but just a little bit of easing in the right direction is often all you need to be able to make sure that it's making good contact at all positions wherever the wheel is and whatever corner it's going round. So with all the electrical connectivity issues sorted, one more thing that can disrupt the performance of the locomotive is how well oiled all the different joints and moving parts are. all of the locomotives will come from the factory ready oiled and greased, and so they'll run nice and smooth for quite a while. But the more you use them, or the longer you've had them, the more likely it is that that oil and grease will have slowly worn away or disappeared. Also, if you're using your locomotives a lot in a dusty environment, or perhaps near the carpet where there's lots of fluff, then that can get stuck to the oil and soaked up, and so the whole thing can start to slow things down. So, what we need is to add a little bit more oil. Now, this is the oil that we use. There are lots of different varieties, but this is from Pico. This is their Electro Lube, or Power Lube. This may only look like a little bottle, but this has lasted us for quite a few years now, because you only ever need to use just a little tiny amount at any one point. The end of it actually has like a little nozzle for you to squeeze it out from, but that nozzle, even though it looks very tiny, is still far too big to be able to apply oil to any of these locomotives. Right, so what I like to use is one of these, which is an artist's small mixing palette, obviously designed for like using watercolours and things and being able to put them in the different sections and make a nice painting. But they work particularly well, I find, for things like this, like oil, and also using glue and things like that. And so for a couple of pounds, which is all it cost from Hobbycraft, I think, it makes a perfect little holder. So all I have to do is put a few drops of the oil into one of the little dimples, and now it's going to make my oiling a lot easier. The other tool you need is a needle. I've got a slightly sort of medium-sized or thick one here, but any needle is good enough really, but it just means that you've got a lot more precision when you're actually applying your oil. So if we have a look at an example, if I bring in the steam locomotive, the 8F again, and put her in the cradle. Now, you need to apply oil to any location where there's a moving part, so that it minimises friction and wear and tear. Now, you can obviously try and guess where those locations are, but if you mainly buy Hornby locomotives, you will have probably noticed in their more sort of recent instruction manuals, they actually indicate to you where you should apply oil with little red dots. I don't think Bachmann or Vitrains or Helgen actually do that, but I might be wrong. But if you use a bit of common sense, you can work it out. The first place to put oil is actually at the axles, so that it can actually lubricate where the wheel turns. So all I need to do is actually just touch my needle into my little pool of oil. So you may not be able to see it, but there's now a tiny little drop of oil on the end of the needle, which is enough that I can then just reach inside, run it against the axle, and that oil has now transferred. And that little drop of oil will then move and lubricate the entire axle once it runs a little bit. So I do that again, push the wheel the other way, reach inside, and just apply it to the axle. Now, when you're oiling the wheels, you need to be careful that you don't actually get any on the wheel surface itself, because that will then obviously reduce friction between the wheel and the track, which will make it harder for it to run. And you'll find that just that little bit of oil will then spread across your entire track and cause you no end of problems and lots of cleaning. So be careful with that one. With steam locomotives, you obviously also have a lot of moving parts here with all the linkage, and so again you need to make sure you apply a drop to each one of these moving points. So touch into my pool, get a little drop on the needle, and then just touch around the joint there, and at the next one there, and at the next one there. And I'm not sure how well the camera will be picking this up, but I can just see a little glistening drop around each of these points, which, as I say, when you then run it in, they'll get into all the little cracks and crevices and lubricate it nicely. With a diesel or an electric locomotive, the action is the same, but obviously you haven't got the linkage this time, so just a little drop of oil and apply it at the axle is all you need to do for those. The other place in a locomotive where you might find some moving parts is actually inside the motor. So if we have a look at some of the mechanics inside this locomotive, you'll notice that with a ring-field motor you've got all of these cogs that transfer the motion from the central spindle through to all the wheels. So again, with our needle we can just drop a little bit of oil onto the actual cogs, like so, so that when they move around they transfer that to all the different parts. With steam locomotives and other locomotives like that, getting to the motor is a lot harder, but on some of them, particularly the Hornby ones, you'll actually notice there's a very tiny little hole or window in the base where you can see that cog, and again you can apply a little bit of oil to that part and that will transfer to the gearing and the mechanism inside the motor housing. Okay, and so finally the last part of our locomotive care video is to then just give your once over around the entire locomotive, looking at detailing. Things like the little bits that are added on here on locomotives such as this can easily be knocked or dislodged when you're doing all of this different work, and so it's important to run around and just check that everything is still in place. So for example, I can just notice that this little piece here is starting to fall out, so this is my opportunity to just nudge that back into place before she goes back onto the track and goes back to her normal duties.